Here's a brief history of the Sacramento music scene. Going back to the 1940s, there was a band called Dick Juergens and his orchestra, which had a national hit back in 1942 called One Dozen Roses. They made several recordings and were pretty well known locally and got to tour the national circuit. In the 1950s, Rose Maddox was signed to Columbia Records, and she became a well-known country artist, especially with a string of hits in the 1960s. Growing up in the Carmichael area in the 1950s was Lynn Anderson, who went on to have several country hits in the 60s and 70s, including Rose Garden, which was a national smash on the pop charts. Also in the 1960s, a psychedelic band called Oxford Circle was distributed by Mercury Records. It didn't really go far, but the next project of singer Gary Yoder was CAC, and they were signed to Epic Records. And that didn't really go too far either, but their self-titled album was pretty much a psychedelic masterpiece and included a great song called Lemonade Kid, which was played a lot on KZAP in their early freeform days. KZAP was launched in 1968. There was another local band called The New Breed in the 1960s that featured Timothy B. Schmidt, who went on to join Poco and the Eagles, and he sang lead on their hit I Can't Tell You Why. The 60s also had a one-hit wonder. It might have been the first big pop hit to come out of Sacramento as far as artists, even though they recorded the song in Los Angeles. That was the group Spiral Staircase, and their one hit was called More Today Than Yesterday. It almost made the national top 10. In the 1970s, a group called Fanny had some hits. They weren't major hits, but they were signed to Reprise Records and then Casablanca Records. And they were originally called the Svelts, and they were like one of the first female rock bands in history, all females. They started out doing covers in Sacramento, then they moved on to Los Angeles and became Fanny. And again, they had about 4 albums that came out, and they worked with some major producers like Todd Rundgren. And also in the 1970s, you started having some bands or some familiar people on the local scene that joined national bands. I mentioned Timothy B. Schmidt. There was also Craig Chaquiso, who went on to join Jefferson Starship. And another local figure was Roger Voudouris, who had worked with Skips Music. He had a national hit called Get Used to It, and he went on to become a huge success in Australia. That song even hit #1 in Australia. In the 1980s, Sacramento started to appear more on the national music radar with a group, Steel Breeze. Their hit You Don't Want Me Anymore made the national top 20. They were signed to RCA Records briefly. Some of the members of the group went on to become part of another local supergroup called The Features, and they became Pride in Peril, who ended up in the Doors movie in the early 90s. Also in the 1980s, City Kid became Tesla. Everybody knows that story, how they got signed to Geffen Records and went on to become Sacramento's most successful band. They sold over 15 million albums. Let's see, did I miss anyone in the 80s? Actually, a bunch. There are plenty. There was Club Nouveau, headed by Jay King, and he was signed to Warner Brothers. He actually had his own King J record label that I believe had a deal with Warner Brothers, and they had a #1 hit called Lean on Me, which was a cover of the Bill Withers #1 hit. And Bourgeois Tag had some hits in the 1980s. One was called Mutual Surrender. Didn't make the top 40, but it was a nice song that was big locally. And then they actually did start making the national charts with a song called I Don't Mind at All. And then in the 1990s, several bands got signed thanks to airplay from Quad, who helped elevate the local scene. Cake was one of those bands who went on to national success. They were already kind of getting airplay on college stations, but they were signed to Capricorn Records and then later on Columbia Records. Their hit The Distance was kind of their breakthrough single in 1996 that Quad helped play a lot. And other bands to get signed out of the region in that era were Oleander, and they were signed to Universal Republic. Papa Roach, who really came from Vacaville, they had a record deal, and so did Deftones, who got early airplay on Quad back in the mid-90s. And in the 2000s, we didn't hear as many stories about bands getting signed, but End Ever After had a deal with Epic Records, and they had a top 25 hit on the rock charts in 2007. And Jackie Green, who grew up in Sacramento and put together a lot of solo recording projects, he went on to join the Black Crowes in 2012. So that's kind of a synopsis of the Sacramento music scene as far as people going beyond the region. There's also been a lot of local songs that were really good and even got some attention, like Carry Me Back by Crayon back in 1980. And just lots of other cool stuff. Harrison Price had a good song called Spiritual Zoo. But basically, the Sacramento music scene has a list of maybe, well, over 200 songs that are worth checking out.